Good evening and welcome to this evening's Adam Smith Institute webinar. Thank you very much all for registering and spending an hour of your Tuesday evening with us. My name is Daniel Pryor. I'm going to be chairing this evening's webinar. I am the head of programs at the Adam Smith Institute. And for those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time and aren't familiar with who we are and what we do, we're a free market think tank based in London in the UK. And our goal is to try and change policy as well as public opinion through our research, as well as media events such as this and our education programs. So this evening's webinar is focused on the upcoming planning bill announced in last month's Queen's speech. Meaningful planning reform is something that we at the ASI have been campaigning on for over a decade, a very long time. So this is a topic that's very close to our hearts here. And the government looks set to move towards a zonal planning system that tries to front load development decisions into the creation of local plans rather than the current system's more discretionary case-by-case approach. And there's also been talk, not necessarily confirmation, of giving locals more control over things like design codes, as well as very much talked about policies like street votes. There's discussion about higher housing targets based on local need and local prices, and potentially, although I'm sure we'll get onto this, and there's been some pre-submitted questions on this, green belt reform as well. And the supporters of the planning bill they'll often claim that it kind of helps to deliver homes that are desperately needed to alleviate our long-running and well-known about housing crisis and the sort of positive consequences that come with that, such as boosting growth and innovation. But there are critics, and they come from both sides of the housing development and planning debate. On the one hand, you've got the fairly unsurprising MPs who are fearful of constituent backlash and overdevelopment as they see it in their constituencies, and they're worried that the bill might reduce the voice of locals in planning decisions. But on the other hand, you've also got some longer standing advocates of planning reform who are concerned that the planning bill might not be, or it might end up being too watered down by rebel MPs to actually end up making the sort of difference that we need to do. So to answer some of these questions, to go into some more detail about what the planning bill involves and some of the debates surrounding it, we're delighted to be joined by three brilliant experts in housing policy to chat about this subject and whether the planning bill will make the sort of changes that can tackle the housing crisis. And first up, we're pleased to be joined by Anya Martin, who is the director of Priced Out, a volunteer-run organisation campaigning for policies that make the housing system work better. So Anya, I guess if you could kick us off by sketching out why our current system could be improved on, shall we say, and also the broader reasons why we need some reform in our planning laws.
Thank you, and hello everyone. So I'm Anya Martin, I'm the director of Priced Out, and we are England's campaign for housing affordability. So we fight for everyone priced out of the homes that they want, where they want them, whether they're renters or wannabe first-time buyers. So we are an entirely grassroots volunteer-led campaign. There's about 20 or 30 of us, mostly renters who have had the experience of the sharp end of renting ourselves. We're all doing this on our free time and around our day jobs, which goes to show just how passionate people are about changing this. And we are very rapidly growing as well and looking at how we can expand and advance our cause by making use of the voices, especially of young people who have been locked out of the housing market. So our focus is very much on using robust economic evidence about how housing can be made more affordable while also delivering a better experience of renting or buying. And as Daniel said, I'm going to set out why we need reform in the first place. So probably quite obvious to most of the people listening, but housing is too expensive. Across England, real house prices are 4 times higher now than they were in 1970, and in London it's even more dramatic. Rents in much of the southeast of England are through the roof, and even people on relatively high incomes are only able to afford bedrooms in some areas of the country. Now, this has a negative impact not only on renters' finances, but also on the quality of housing that's available to them. So there is such a high demand for housing that landlords are able to let the shoddiest of properties and manage them in the shoddiest of ways because there is so much demand that they don't have to compete on price or quality. These prices are an obvious and direct cause of homelessness as well. So it goes right through the income spectrum. Now, a lot of people who have rented for some time tend to think of this as they become accustomed to it, or they think of it as inevitable, and we see it as a normal feature of renting life for young people. And what Priced Out argues is that it is not. There are places in the world where rents are vastly more affordable, where the typical quality of housing is better, and where tenants are able to negotiate on a much more equal footing with their landlords. In fact, many, if not most, of our comparator nations in Europe and the Western world do better than we do. Why? There are many factors that can increase the cost of housing, from rising incomes to falling interest rates. Most of these are shared internationally. They're not unique to England or indeed its most expensive regions and high demand cities. The major thing that does distinguish us from our comparator nations is how few homes we build for a country of our size and wealth. England has a very weak price elasticity of supply, and that is how many more homes are built in response to an increase in prices. That price elasticity figure is a huge deciding factor on how affordable homes are, as recently argued by the Bank of England. And in fact, last year, for instance, London built just 40 homes per 10,000 residents. You can compare that to similar cities. San Francisco, which famously has one of the worst housing supply challenges in the world, built 53 in that same time. Sydney in Australia, also beset by supply challenges, managed 70. So we really are quite bad. Why? Our planning system is extremely slow and unwieldy by international comparison. It can take years to gain a planning permission, even if you meet all of the required requirements and all of the required regulations rather, and the local plan. We have an internationally very unusual system in that it's discretionary. So you have to meet the rules, which are extraordinarily complex and sometimes even contradictory, but then you also have to go through a process which can be highly politically challenging. And this in particular is a nightmare for smaller builders who can't spread the risk of refusal or delay over many sites. Our planning system gives an undue and unfair influence to people who are by and large already homeowners. The planning system exists for a reason, and that reason is to prevent negative externalities on people that are living near these new developments. That is a good reason. The problem is that the benefits of building go to people who, for the most part, do not realise that these homes will be their future homes because they don't live there yet, they don't exist yet. So they don't have a strong incentive or even necessarily an awareness to push in favour of those homes. Whereas the people who live there already, and again, almost by definition, largely do not need a home in that area because they have one. So the benefits of house building are dispersed widely amongst future residents, renters, and wannabe first-time buyers, whereas the downsides are concentrated on people living locally already. And our planning system focuses on those concentrated downsides. Even the way we advertise planning applications by sticking posters on lampposts in the local area implicitly favours the concerns of the already housed over the potential beneficiaries of new housing. We ignore the voice of younger people and people who do not live in the area yet. Our planning system permits and encourages corruption, because if you don't know whether or not you'll get a permission as a builder, it may well pay to wine and dine the decision makers who can approve it. Anti-corruption campaign group Transparency International found that planning was rife with corruption. And this is, in our view, because it is discretionary and not rules-based. We arbitrarily ban and limit building over huge swathes of land. Green belts, which contrary to popular belief are not an environmental designation. It's just an arbitrary belt designed to stop cities growing. It can contain plenty of brownfield lands or things like golf courses, which are in fact horribly environmentally damaging. As an example, golf courses in London's Greenbelt cover an area twice the size of Kensington and Chelsea. You could build hundreds of thousands of homes, effectively end London's housing crisis, and also make that land more biodiverse through the additions of gardens and parks. It is really win-win. We don't release enough new land, but we also don't use the brownfield sites we have effectively. So contrary to the environment-hating credentials that some would like to quite mysteriously pin on us, we have strongly pushed in favour of densification and efficient usage of already developed land, not only because this means building where people want to live, but it also helps to preserve greenfield. Unfortunately, this is often prevented by the planning system. I've lost count of the number of developments in transport accessible areas that are initially proposed for, say, 5 stories and then are chipped down to 3 through the process of councillors getting involved. So the result of this is that people squeeze into less space in existing housing, which we have seen, terrible overcrowding in some areas and young people living in shared houses into their 30s or even older, or that they have to live further out beyond the green belts and potentially in car-dependent communities, which again we've seen. So to summarise, the point that I want to make is that the planning system is largely responsible for our housing affordability challenges, and it doesn't even deliver on what it is supposed to deliver in terms of public transport accessibility, environmental protections, amenity access. precisely because the good work of many planners is chipped away at by this highly political, irrational and unfair system. Our current system works for no one except planning lawyers and consultants. Now, I really believe that we can deliver win-win solutions here, but that does require a sensible and honest conversation about planning reform, about who sets to benefit from building new homes and whether or not their voice is represented in that process. And this bill does provide that opportunity for those who are willing to engage with it. So very much in favour of planning reform. It needs to be done. It needs to be a considered process, and I really would strongly push people towards getting involved in that process rather than lobbying against it as a rule. And I think on that point, I will pass on to my co-panelist.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Anya. Just a quick follow-up from me before we move on to our next speaker. You successfully myth-busted a few common things there with regards to how interest rates affect all countries, not just the UK, in an interesting and unique way, and interesting specific local areas. One of the other ones that comes up quite a lot is kind of the idea that actually the planning system isn't really a big problem in the UK because most planning permission is granted, right, in 9 and 10 planning permissions. I was wondering if you quickly tackle that before we move on to our next panelist.
Yeah, so the 9 in 10 planning permissions being approved is, in my opinion, a totally useless and quite meaningless statistic, because you only apply for planning permission in the first place if you are relatively confident that you are going to be approved, because it's a really, really expensive, slow process. If you have a bit of land, you want to develop that relatively quickly because you want to turn that into a profit. So you're not really going to waste time putting in planning applications that are directly opposed to local policies or building regulations or so on, because you know you will be rejected and you've just wasted all of that time, all of the consultants that you've had to employ to do all of the various aspects that it takes to do a planning permission, from everything from transport to the kind of delivery of water and so on. You've paid for all of these services, you want it to get through. You're not going to put through a planning application that you know won't get through. So the fact that 1 in 10 planning applications is denied suggests that these builders were trying to meet those rules and were unable to do so. So it's not a victory, right? You could put in 1 million planning applications on the green belt, and the odds are you would get very few, if very few of those in. You don't do it, it doesn't happen. So 9 in 10 is pretty meaningless.
Well, thanks for tackling that, and I think we'll now move on to next speaker. And just a reminder for those of you watching along that we are going to have a audience Q&A session after all of our speakers' remarks. So please do stick any questions, comments, agreements, vehement disagreements that you may have in the Q&A box or the chat box. But for now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Anthony Breach, a senior analyst at the Centre for Cities, which aims to help the UK's largest cities and towns realise their economic potential. And from your perspective, I was hoping that you could give some more detail on some of the proposed reforms in the planning bill and give your opinion on whether it is likely to address some of the issues that Anya has already pointed out.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Daniel. I think that's a great place to start. And I think the best way to sort of talk about the changes being proposed in the white paper is to talk a little bit more detail about the current system first. So I'll give a quick summary of, from a technical perspective, how the current system works, so that we can, in the second half of my talk a little bit about what the government is proposing and how it compares and how likely it is to address the housing shortage. So, as both Daniel and Anya have mentioned, the current planning system in England is highly discretionary by international standards. And what does the word discretionary mean in this context? Well, it means there's lots of case-by-case decision making, which means that if you propose something that complies with the local plan that you make and follows kind of all the rules, you can still be denied planning permission, either by planning officers themselves or when it goes to a vote on a planning committee of elected councillors. It can also be denied planning permission at that point. And these matters go beyond kind of even the principle of whether development can take place or not, so whether it's on the greenbelt land or greenfield or brownfield land, but can also relate to matters such as the aesthetics and design of the building, as well as the funding arrangements and the planning conditions for infrastructure and funding requirements that the council may attach to any particular development. This is all negotiated kind of one by one between developers, the council, and also campaigners and activists who get involved with the planning system. And the effect of this is effectively to be a ratchet and on new housing, which reduces the amount of new housing supply, ratchets down the number of homes which are proposed and then built, and ultimately acts as a rationing system for new homes that come forward. So what happens in effect is that because it's so uncertain, because planning permissions are granted out in such a politicized and insensitive way to market signals and prices, we have a complete disconnect for local supply from local demand. So there's cities and large towns which have very expensive housing, very, very high demand for new homes, such as Oxford or Brighton will often find themselves building fewer homes than places like Wakefield or Telford, which have lower demand because they have less prosperous urban labour markets. So the kind of solution here is to reconnect local supply of housing to local demand and building more in more prosperous areas. And from a technical perspective, what that means is a more rules-based planning system, so one that's closer to our international peers, where if you can propose something that complies with the local plan, you must be given planning permission by the local council. So broadly, does the government's proposals fit with that criteria, that roadmap for reform and an end to the housing shortage and crisis? Well, there's really three different pillars to what the government is proposing. There's technical changes to how development should take place. There's the beauty and design pillar, which they've proposed, and also a pillar relating to new funding and finance arrangements for development. And I'll go through each of these in turn. So the first pillar, where we see the government's proposed in that pillar 3 different areas which will apply to all land within England. There will be growth zones, where if land is allocated in that zone, then developers will be able to build essentially what they like, perhaps in tune with local design codes, but with a much less discretionary process in which, if it's in a growth zone, you can build, and that rule is set in advance. They're considering implementing what they call renewal zones as well, where these would apply more to kind of urban areas and to suburban and brownfield sites, where there'd be much more opportunities for local residents to get involved in setting design codes. But then if a proposal comes forward which complies with the design code, that the developer is again allowed to build if they follow those rules. And then the third pillar will be, or the third area will be protected areas. So we'll essentially have a system quite close to what we have now currently, with a discretionary kind of case-by-case process for areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks, existing greenbelt land, where it's we may accept that there's still some scope for more oversight by locally elected politicians and planners, rather than those areas where we accept and embrace kind of development and change. The other 2 pillars relating to beauty and to the funding and finance elements of the proposals are also kind of interesting and shouldn't be neglected in the context of the reforms. In that, for the beauty pillar, the way in which the government is proposing that new design codes be introduced both at a national level, but also providing an opportunity for local residents to create their design codes. This would be quite a radical shift from the current approach, where we have individual comments and objections and vetoes at the proposal stage for each individual house or site which is developed. And by moving towards a more code-based approach, the government is aiming to not just kind of increase the supply of housing, but then also make the system more democratic by having a wider range of people participating in the planning process and achieving a stronger consensus and a more solid and trustworthy kind of consultation process than exists currently. And for the third pillar, rather than having a system where contributions by developers are negotiated case by case, and you get this trench warfare between developers and councils as they fight to give more money, or the fight to take more money, or give less money. Instead, have a flat fee where on the sale of the development, a percentage of that goes straight to the council, and the council can use that to fund whatever infrastructure the redevelopment requires in that particular area. So that will be, again, a move away from the discretionary process. Our kind of overall assessment at Central Cities is that the planning reforms, if they are bold and if the government commits to introducing them as broadly as set out within the white paper, that it would be a big step, a big improvement over the current system. It would help reconnect local supply to local demand across the country. And then the housing outcomes across the country would improve. Housing would become more affordable. We would have better quality housing, and also we would have a more democratic planning system where rather than having individual housing activists and groups trying to veto new development, we'd have a much more rules-based and consensual process. But that's my overarching summary of the existing system and the new proposals.
Well, thanks very much, Anne. Before we move on, there's a few questions I see coming in already from the audience, so thank you all very much for that. There's one that I want you all to comment on kind of international comparators of housing that we can maybe get onto the main Q&A. But I guess one for me is, in terms of what you spelled out there, the government's main pillars for reform, there's obviously a lot of to and froing back and forth on the political stage for this as to how much of it is actually going to go ahead. I mean, one of the examples is the kind of 3 designated growth, renewal, and protection zones as well. Do you see any of this kind of being watered down significantly? Would you kind of give us a perspective on where you think the government's thinking is at in terms of what they originally proposed in the white paper and what may come out once the bill's presented to Parliament?
What I would say is I think that the government understands that the nature of the housing problem, that it's a shortage caused by our unusually dysfunctional planning system compared to our international comparators. So I think they're pretty committed to getting through major planning reform of some kind as over the coming year from the Queen's speech. I think it's a little bit difficult to say exactly how the politics of this play out in Parliament, because the bill itself still needs to be published. We haven't seen the response yet to the consultation responses to the white paper, which would begin to set out what the actual legislation will look like in practice. But I think there's a strong consensus within government that the system needs to be less discretionary than it currently is, and whether that means we have growth, renewal, and protected areas, or just growth and protected, or we have additional protections for greenbelt, or we get quite different changes to how the funding and finance system works. I think the government has a good understanding and a good set of objectives for what they want to accomplish from the reform. And I'd expect that they will push quite hard to meet as many of those as they can.
Well, fingers crossed. And speaking of the politics of all this, we're going to move on to our next speaker before we go to questions from you watching along at home. And that is John Myers, who is the co-founder of YIMBY Alliance and London YIMBY, which are both campaigns to end the housing crisis with the support of local people. And John, I know you have a presentation. You can probably start the screen share now. I was hoping that you could situate the planning bill in the context of some of the previous attempts that we've made to reform the planning system in the UK. Have we been here before? And more importantly, have we learned some of the lessons from perhaps past failures or past concerns when it comes to planning reform?
Thanks very much, Daniel. Can you see my slides?
Not yet, I can't, unfortunately.
Let me
there we go.
One more time.
I can see them now.
Ah.
And they just disappeared.
So let me try them one more time. Right, you should now have them. So I'm just going to, as you say, I'm going to give a potted history of planning reforms in this country and just set out, basically cover 3 things. So as Dominic Cummings, super forecasters will tell you, if you want to estimate the future, the best thing to do is to see what you can learn, first of all, from the past. And they talk about the base rate for success. The base rate here is challenging because pretty much every previous major reform has failed or eventually even backfired. And if you dig into why they failed, ultimately it tended to be due to an insufficient understanding of the problem. Now, there are reasons to hope, and there's some very encouraging signs, but I think my overall message is that there is still everything to play for. So just taking a step back, Anya made some excellent points. A century ago, a house literally cost less than a car. And since then, almost everything we make has got much better and cheaper, except homes. If you look at the last 700 years of UK house prices, you can actually see on this graph when we first did a big bang reform that was intended to fix housing, we actually banned new housing in 1939 because of the Second World War, but then we did a huge reform in 1947, and real house prices have gone up by a factor of 8 at least since then. So the total value of UK homes today, minus the cost of building them, is about £4 trillion, which means if you dig it down into it, that homes probably cost housing costs about 3 times more than it needs to. But we have plenty of space. Most of London doesn't look like these Georgian terraces in Bedford Square, nor does it look like these Edwardian mansion blocks in Westminster. And by the way, until 1939, you could build this without needing any planning permission at all. Most of London looks more like this. 20th century suburbia, some of it in great shape, some of it perhaps less well maintained. And there's probably possibility to do more with that land. And if you look at the map of London, the sort of purple bits in the center are the mansion blocks, the terraced housing that I was talking about, but the vast range of the lighter blue and the paler white is the vast expanse of suburbia, where if we put our minds to it, we could probably use some of that land better and win the support of existing residents in doing it. Because since 1939, we've never grown the number of homes. If you look at the blue line, which is the net change, because sometimes homes get built by pulling other homes down. Since 1939, we've never grown the number of homes at the percentage rate we did in the 1840s, let alone the far higher rate of the 1930s. And we know London can build homes far more quickly than it is doing because it has in the past. So there've been over 70 years of planning reform failure, starting with the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, with the best of intentions, was introduced with no pilots, and it imposed a new requirement for permission on almost all development and 100% tax on the value of new permissions. And no one tried to work out if that could politically endure. And of course it didn't, because in 1951, the next Conservative government removed that tax on the value uplift after planning permission. And the net effect of that action-reaction was ultimately vastly less house building than the 1930s. And so land prices, because of a shortage of land where you're allowed to build, have continued to rise from the 1950s to today. Thatcher, Blair and Major all tried to fix it, got nowhere. Cameron also didn't manage to fix it. I'm not sure Theresa May really did very much to try, to be honest, but all of these big reform proposals have either not happened, they've happened and they've been reversed, or they've happened and they've backfired. So for 70 years, the often very talented people who generally intended to fix housing have mainly failed or actually made the situation worse. And why is that? Well, I'd suggest there were 5 reasons. Mainly that they didn't understand the problem or the underlying economics. They didn't understand the benefits of cities. They didn't understand basic supply and demand in some cases. They didn't understand incentives or the externalities that Anya talks about. Crucially, they didn't understand that this is a non-zero sum game. So it is possible to have outcomes where almost everybody benefits. And they certainly hadn't learned the lessons of how to intelligently design policy based on the lessons of economics. Now, cities are important because they let people be more productive. And we can see an example of where that wasn't understood in how the planning system deliberately banned new offices and new homes in Birmingham after the war, damaging its economy, its productivity, so that it started to lose the incredible success that it had had through the first part of the 20th century. And then just on basic supply and demand, if house prices are lower in the north and they're higher in the south, clearly building more homes in the north is not going to help with that problem. And yet you still see people advocating that as a quote unquote solution. And then incentives and externalities. It was in 2010 that the coalition government got rid of the targets that the previous Labour government had imposed in order to get more housing through. And in general, you'll find that politicians in power generally want house prices to rise because they know that they will win more votes. If that happens, they'll get a little housing boom. And that's from parties on all sides. As Anya said, homeowners want protection from the effects of new building. And because they're roughly 2/3 of the voters, the trouble is that they tend to outvote the tenants. They worry about pollution, congestion, a whole range of things. And so, to quote Sam Bowman, planning to smash the NIMBYs when they're 2/3 of the voters is a bit like the Polish army gearing its cavalry up to smash the Wehrmacht in 1939. And you can see a long line of grand ambitions thwarted. The New Towns programme, which included places like Milton Keynes, never got anywhere near to the numbers of houses that it intended, still less the number of houses that were needed in order to meet the growing population and the growing demand. And they were often so unpopular that, for example, Stevenage, which Housing Minister Lewis Silkin in the 50s created, was named Silkingrad by hostile locals. There was a huge plan to develop a new airport at Covington, which never happened. And so the problem with all of this is that people keep forgetting that it's a non-zero sum game. Because it's a huge deadweight loss, like you have with a cartel, society as a whole is worse off. And that means if you design your reforms carefully, you can do things that are nearly win-win. And planning reform, like many other broken sectors, is literally decades behind the state of the art in economics-driven reform design, not least in failing to understand the risks of reforms backfiring, as they so painfully have so many times over the last 70 years. Well, will the bill succeed? I think zoning, as Anthony said, is certainly is a critical element to reduce costs. It increases predictability. It is inherently a good thing, and there's no reason why certainty has to be bad for anyone. You can create certainty for good development that everyone will be happy with. Certainty makes more marginal sites more likely to be developed. So that's all great, but we have to remember it's not a panacea. As you'll see from Manhattan, where 40% of the buildings would be illegal under the new zoning code that's been brought in since they were built. And of course, the bill is not proposing to do Japanese style zoning laws. Height limits are going to be set locally, like in the US. So we need to make sure that local decision makers have incentives to allow more homes. And targets are one option, but targets have been reversed many times before. So what about carrots instead of 6? And this is where I have the most optimism, because the white paper supported incentive-driven mechanisms to actually get homeowners to be really enthusiastic about housing. And that is the absolute critical thing you need if you want your planning reform to generate many more homes in the places where it's most needed and to endure. This is a proposal called street votes, where, as mentioned, the residents can pick a design code to allow more housing. It was suggested by the ASI in 2017 and by Policy Exchange in 2021. That first paper was by me. And so that street votes are a rare way to get homeowners to support more homes because they can see the benefit. And technically, they make planning protections tradable so people can negotiate to get win-win outcomes. The economist Ronald Coase is the big authority in this area. So on the left, if you have a rundown street, I'm not saying this is, but if you do have a rundown street, then if you're a homeowner, this could be a potential goldmine if you suddenly give yourselves permission to create a beautiful mansion block or terraced houses. And that could be life-changing for many people. So fixing the incentives, I would suggest, is one of the most promising aspects of the white paper and the reform proposals. So the history is not encouraging. I think we understand why they failed, and I think there's good prospects for the bill, although there's still everything to play for. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, thanks very much, John. Before we move on to our general Q&A and invite our other panelists in, just a quick follow-up on the street votes specifically. I'm interested to know if, it's one of these ideas that sounds wonderful in theory. Is there much evidence of kind of support or demand for this? Have you spoken to any people that, could potentially be affected by this, and they say, yes, actually, I would take advantage of this policy?
Yeah, so two things. So first of all, if you want overseas example, in Tel Aviv last year has an analogous provision where they let the residents of an apartment block vote to redevelop it or to extend it. That provision accounted for 1/3, 35% in fact, of the new homes in Tel Aviv last year, right? So there's an enormous contribution. And secondly, if you go and talk to suburban homeowners, I'm absolutely not saying that every homeowner wants change, but there's a number of people out there who facing constraints. Their family doesn't have enough room, they want to expand, they need to move in a grandparent, or they can't afford a new home, they can't afford to help their kids buy new homes or afford to live in the area. Many children are being forced away to move away from the area they grew up in because housing is so unaffordable. And many of those people are very interested. Now, I'm certainly not saying that everyone will be, but we only need a few % of streets to do this, to make an absolutely transformative difference to London's housing supply, because of the 5 or 6 times increase in the number of homes that you can get on a low-rise plot if you turn it into terraced flats or mansion blocks.
Well, I think it's time to open it up to general Q&A now and bring in other 2 speakers. I'm going to kick things off with a question to all of you, I guess, to answer in turn. And we always give our director, Dr. Raymond Butler, a question on our webinars. He is our director overall. And his question is on other countries' planning systems. Are other countries' planning systems, as has been suggested, better than ours? And if we were to pick a particular country that we'd look to as a model, or particular countries or areas, what would we look at for trying to improve our own? Maybe to go to you, Anya, first.
Yeah, so the example that I would like to cover is actually not the ideal system, because actually I think we're a very, very long way from the ideal system, but it's a country that started from a very similar position to us. So Sydney in Australia, New South Wales, that they actually use an English style discretionary planning system, which, as I've said, is an unusual way to do it. And it's not how most of our comparative countries do it. And they had all of the problems that we do. So extremely slow supply, local backlashes against new development, worsening affordability. They have all of this, and crucially, they have all of the same macroeconomic factors that push up the cost of housing, low interest rates, rising population, rising incomes, and so on. So they're very much in the same position as us. It is also a superstar city with investors flowing in and so on. So really quite similar. They realised they had a problem and they set up a commission to deal with that. They pushed through several reforms, so new higher house building targets. Councils were required to update their plans to meet those targets. Those with the highest targets received additional funding to do so as well, so it wasn't just the stick. They were issued centrally designed guidelines to help them do this, to kind of upzone areas to allow higher buildings. They simplified the release of new land, and crucially, they also depoliticised the planning process by removing councillors and developers, so both, from planning panels, and instead appointing independent experts on it. It worked, and it worked very quickly. So, as I said, amid the same macroeconomic context that we have, Sydney rents fell by 7% over 4 years, from 2015 to 2019. Prices fell from an average of over $1 million Australian dollars to 865,000 Australian dollars over just a year. So quite a massive drop. And I think that is very interesting because it shows that A, you can do it, B, you can do it from our context, from a system that was not substantially different from ours, as far as I can tell, and C, that you don't even need enormous reforms. You don't need to fundamentally redesign your system. You just need to look at what the kind of pinch points are. And also, actually, you can do it against local pushback, because there were very many people who pushed back at this, especially the councils with the highest house prices. As we see here, the people who are most vociferous against new housing supply tend to be the wealthiest people. You can do it, and it can work, and it can work really, really quickly. So I always point to that example. But I also think Ant will have some other good ones.
Yep, go ahead, Ant.
Yep, so I'm going to take exactly the opposite approach to Anya and say, like, if we were to copy paste the ideal system existing anywhere in the world at the moment without any thought for political constraints at all, I think the best example has to be Japan, where it's sort of the upside down of our system in some ways. It's what I would call a flexible zoning system, in that they have national government in Japan writes a zoning code of 12 different zones, ranging from kind of suburban residential areas with small offices and shops at the bottom to kind of, as you ascend like a pyramid, to a more intense kind of city centre skyscraper zone at the top. And as you kind of ascend the zones, as land gets allocated to more intense zones, you can continue to do kind of less intense activities within those zones. And as with I was saying it earlier, they're a system where if you propose something that complies with the zoning and with the very strong building regs because of all the earthquakes that Japan has, then you can just crack on and you can build whatever you like, essentially. And their system, we build about 240,000 homes a year, and that's a decade-long high. Japan builds about 800,000 homes a year, and their population is falling currently. And not surprisingly, that they have far more affordable housing than we do, including in places like Tokyo, which are very high demand and growing all the time. So I think if we were to sort of, politics doesn't work this way, but copy paste an ideal system, I think Japan comes pretty close. And in any case, we have lots to learn from in terms of how a system should work from their experience.
So we've got Anya's possible dream, Ant's maybe being a pessimist, slightly impossible dream, at least for the moment, but maybe in the far future. John, have you got any other examples that you'd point to as places that have had success? Obviously, you mentioned Tel Aviv earlier.
Yeah, no, I think I still think Tel Aviv is probably the best example in terms of something that is based on the interviews and the testing with stakeholders that we've done, likely to be politically much easier in this country. So obviously I would be delighted if we could switch to a Japanese zoning system tomorrow. I'll be thrilled if we can get to Sydney. I think, so there's a whole science of trying to understand and analyze whether these reforms are practical, as Ant and Anya know. And I think the evidence is fairly strong that there's a much stronger resistance here than there is in Sydney or in Tokyo. And so I very much hope that we can get to a more certain, predictable system. It will have to address design questions which are much less salient in Tokyo, perhaps a little more so in Sydney, and it will have to address the fact that we have a much older housing stock, and that we were the first country into the Industrial Revolution, and so we have an extraordinarily large amount of very central and very historic buildings. Mainly alleviated only by the Luftwaffe, which is responsible for the fastest growing areas of London, according to one study. So that sort of tells you what the effect of the planning system is. But I think it remains to be seen, and let's keep our fingers crossed.
Well, we've had the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. All we need now is a Kriegsmarine reference, and we'll have the three branches there. A question for you, Anya, I think, because you mentioned this in your remarks from Jonathan Neiman. How much impact could reform or improvement in this area have on homelessness specifically?
Yeah, so there was actually a quite interesting study that came out of the US a while ago that looked at the impact of market housing on homelessness. So the way it measured supply and availability of housing was through the vacancy rate, so the number of homes that are empty. Obviously, the more supply you have, the more empties you will have. And what it found is that a 10% increase in the vacancy rate results in a 6% fall in homelessness. And this was across the US. They picked a number of kind of city region areas. Now, our vacancy rate in this country is 2.6% roughly. It's one of the lowest in Europe. So unsurprisingly, we're one of the more expensive areas. So if we were to increase that amount by 10%, and by the way, this is a percent increase, not a percentage point increase. So that would be a change from 2.6% to roughly 2.9%. The effect, if the effect is the same here as it is in the USA, then we would expect to see a 6% fall in homelessness. So it's a very, very small difference. I don't know off the top of my head how many more homes you would have to build in order to increase the vacancy rate by that level, because obviously most new homes are occupied pretty quickly, as you would expect from a massively undersupplied market. But it is quite a substantial impact. And obviously the people that we're talking about here that would not end up homeless when they otherwise would have, they're mainly the people at the kind of better off end of homelessness, right? People that perhaps do have an income, but it's very low, and they're at risk of eviction and so on. So it helps to protect those people from homelessness at quite a rapid rate. But most importantly, this study looked at market housing specifically, only private house building. In the UK, we have a quite important distinction that new market housing subsidises the development of social housing. A certain proportion of new developments is social housing, some of which will go directly to homeless households. So there's a possibility that that effect is even larger here because of that additional benefit. So in my view, it's potentially enormous, and it's no surprise that we have such terrible homelessness problem when we don't build enough homes.
Another question that just came through in chat from Bridget Mays. How do you propose dealing with buy-to-let and the rise of buy-to-let, which has seen property become a major asset class? And this is something that comes up quite a lot in housing reform discussions, the need to deal with buy-to-let or specifically foreign buyers in many cases as well, pointed out as one of the key causes of the housing shortage. I don't know if anyone has a particular burning desire to answer. Yep, and then we'll go to John afterwards.
Yes, so I think there's two things going on here. There's the sort of pension element and the way in which real estate is used as a safe asset, and a way in which ordinary households save for their retirement. It does present a challenge for that group, and I think it then requires a response. It will in future require a response by government to think about what are other alternative saving vehicles for households as housing becomes more affordable, if the planning reforms work as the government intends. Now, auto-enrollment into pensions will have fixed, certainly for younger people, that kind of saving element, that saving behaviour for that group. But broadly, if the supply of housing expands, then we would expect some of those kind of buy-to-let landlords who already have properties to sell their existing homes, either to newer home buyers as those houses become a bit cheaper, or indeed to developers who would want to redevelop those particular sites, and to the benefit and profit of the buy-to-let landlords themselves. I mean, as John was saying, it's not zero sum here. It's possible for most households to be winners in this environment, but that kind of macro saving question is important, and will need to be considered during the debates.
John?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. I just supplement that by saying, so I think that the best design reforms, as you've seen in California, where the YIMBY movement has successfully got a number of laws passed to get more homes built, and with the street vote suggestion that we in PX put out, is that you design it so that it benefits everyone. And for example, on street votes, we suggest that tenants should get a year's rent refunded if the home that they were occupying is redeveloped. So for many tenants, that's a huge plus, and so you start to square the circle of finding something that benefits landlords and tenants at the same time.
Just following on another question for you, John. I think this is something we discussed a few days ago from one of our fellows, Tim Ambler, and he kind of mentions that we probably all agree planning needs to be streamlined, speeded up, but he points to the planning inspector as a potential source of some of those blockages, and calls actually for it to be abolished at the least. Do you share that view? What role do you think the planning inspector plays here?
I mean, I can certainly share some of the frustrations about slowness and about surprising decisions from the planning inspectorate. I'm not sure, to be honest, that the Secretary of State or particularly the ministry would want to give up the power that the planning inspectorate gives them to override local decisions where they don't conform with national planning policy. I mean, inspectors are essentially the instrument by which the ministry makes sure that local authorities' decisions comply with national planning policy. So I think it would require an enormous reworking of the system to get to that, perhaps, in some distant future where we have strict design rules and zoning and certainty and clarity. The planning inspector won't be needed anymore, because these kind of procedural rules have only really evolved because we didn't have clarity from the start. And the system where you have perfect clarity on what can be built and what can't be built, the planning inspectorate would probably not be necessary.
Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just come in quickly on that. So at Centre for Cities, we are big advocates of devolution, especially to the level of cities and economic geography. But shocking surprise there. But this is one area in which we think that devolution is really about the right responsibility sitting at the right level. So we think that national government has a role to play in the planning system as kind of a referee of the planning system, and then local government are almost the players. And it's the job of national government to ensure that the rules are enforced, and that there is that they write the rule book, etc., on how the system works. And a distinction between, say, the flexible zoning system of Japan and kind of inflexible zoning systems we often see in the United States is that cities and local governments are the both referee and the player for their own zoning systems. And surprise, surprise, they write their zoning systems to be very advantageous to existing residents and to block new people from moving in. And we can see that in a lot of Californian cities, for example. So I think there would, certainly in my ideal vision of how a planning system would work, there would be a planning inspectorate of some kind that would be responsible for keeping local authorities in check, making sure they're following the rules, and providing oversight and help and assistance to local authorities as well.
Question that's come in for you, Anya. I know you mentioned the kind of environmental aspect of planning reform in your opening remarks. And this from Nikki Sinclair asks, are some of the changes to planning policy that have been proposed compatible with the UK hosting COP26 and more generally avoiding the worst case scenarios for climate change? Is planning reform green?
Yes. Well, in my view, planning reform is essential to be green. I mean, it's often, it's spoken about as if it's a battle almost between developers and the environment, and people that want to protect the environment and so on. And as I said earlier, I don't really think that is necessarily the case. And if actually people who are interested in preserving and protecting the environment engage with these policies in better faith and actually looked at how we can plan the extension of our cities in a way that's adequately dense, how we can use existing brownfield land, you know, with proposals like street votes that allow you to make use of land more efficiently. There's no reason we can't preserve, you know, our desirable environments perfectly well, while also making use of the land that we have, and also releasing land that doesn't serve a particularly strong environmental purpose. For instance, things like golf courses, which are actually extraordinarily environmentally damaging. Intensive agricultural land and things like that can also be used for house building, especially if it's near transport. I mean, you get very unusual situations, for instance, where Campaign to Protect Rural England, CPRE, are lobbying against developments that are right beside train stations with access to central London in less than half an hour. That's the ideal place to build blocks of flats. You don't have to use much land. People can access work with public transport. You don't need to have parking spaces. That is the really obvious way to both protect the environment and ensure that housing need is met. They're not opposing views, and treating them like they are is I mean, often I think quite a bad faith argument.
Well, we've probably got time for a couple more questions before we hit time. And one of them, I think you probably all have a great answer for this from Reese Pugh. How should young people specifically be encouraged to speak up during the planning consultation process? Is there, say, an organisation perhaps that they could get involved with to help make this easier? I'll go to you first, John.
There were loads of great organisations. So obviously, obviously Priced Out, and we also encourage people to set up a local YIMBY group, become a member of YIMBY Alliance, and talk to their council and get their MP to support the right measures. So please join everything and do as much as you can.
Anyone else want to shill for their respective organisations? Anya, please go ahead.
Yeah, as John said, Priced Out is very active in this area alongside our sister campaigns in the YIMBY Alliance. We are increasingly, you know, we try to identify developments that we think are very good on various aspects. So not only do they provide a lot of good quality homes, but they also provide affordable homes. They have good access to amenities. They meet all of the criteria for well-planned homes. We will kind of get behind these. We'll work alongside local councils as well to try and encourage them to put these through. And, you know, they almost invariably face large local backlashes, but actually I think it's extraordinarily exciting now that more and more young people are getting involved in these planning applications and are starting to make comments on them. It does seem to me as if something is changing now, and young people are starting to represent their interests. And the thing that I always encourage people to do is just keep speaking, because in some cases politicians they've almost never heard a young person come in and say, actually, I foresee myself living in this kind of home. And it's a shock to them. And, you know, they're not inherently opposed to the idea of building homes. It's just they've got a lot of angry homeowners saying, I don't want this, so why are you building it? And I think the more of us that keep banging that drum, the more impact that we can have collectively and individually in our local areas.
Great. And anything to add?
Yeah, I'd say, you know, if you're a young person talking to your friends, your family, or your local politicians about planning reform and the housing crisis, there's this great organisation called Centre for Cities, which has produced a program of work looking at how the current planning system functions and how it should be reformed. So we've done both reports, which are all available on our website, but also we do a continual series of blogs on on arguments as well that you might have heard, such as we need to build more homes to in the north to do levelling up, or land banking, why that's supposedly the problem. We provided quite clear responses to each of those arguments. So if you've got any questions, by all means, check out our stuff, reach out to me at Centre Cities. Always happy to chat.
Well, I think we're at time, so I'll finish up with one question for each of you on the planning bill specifically. If you could each give one thing that you're optimistic about, that you think is going to be a positive change that's likely to happen, that will get through Parliament, and then one thing that you're a little bit more worried about and that you hope that through the efforts of various fantastic organisations in this sphere, including of course the Adam Smith Institute, we can work towards changing and reforming. And Anya, I'll go to you first on that.
In terms of what I'm optimistic about, I think it is really hard, perhaps even impossible, to design a system that is worse than what we currently have. So I'm relatively optimistic that whatever the case, whatever happens, even if it is watered down, as I hope it won't be, it can't really get any worse. It can only get better. I hope no one starts singing at that point. In terms of what I'm worried about, as you can imagine, I'm worried that it will be watered down. I'm worried that the people that should be endorsing this policy are not doing so as vocally and as regularly as they should be. I do think we need to present a kind of collective voice, and we also need to engage with the opponents of it, because as I've said, I think it is a genuinely win-win situation, and there are plenty more people that could be involved in this coalition if they saw it that way as well. And I think the kind of scepticism about this bill is undue in many places.
To you next, Dan.
So I think the thing I'm most optimistic about is the funding and finance pillar that I mentioned, in which section 106, which is an absolutely terrible form of taxation, in which the amount of tax that developers pay to local authorities is negotiated case by case. That will be replaced by a new levy, which will increase the predictability and kind of reduce the risk for everybody involved, not just developers, but also councils as well. So they know that if they build or provide planning permission for X number of houses, they will get Y amount of revenue in order to support that. And that will help support infrastructure, social housing, etc. So I'm pretty confident that will get through. And the thing where there's the most uncertainty about, certainly, is whether this renewal zone area will be included. I think if that's can be included in the planning proposals, then we have the potential to build like a really, really world-leading planning system, one in which we don't just get faster urban growth and kind of more housing in the right places, but then also gradual and gentle densification of our existing urban form as well, in line with design codes, etc., as the planning white paper is set out. But the government is still debating whether that element should be included within the final bill. So let's wait and see.
Always good to hear support for tax simplification, very sound on an ASI webinar. Finally, to you, John, optimism and perhaps pessimism or worries.
Thanks, Dale. So I'm supremely optimistic about the street votes proposals. As I said, they've been tested with a wide range of stakeholders. It is very popular with residents to have control over their own street, and that aligning the incentives, as we've seen from the international examples, can be extraordinarily powerful in delivering more homes. I'm concerned, as Anthony said, about precisely how some of the zoning implementation is going to be taken forward. I think if we don't have robust design codes in place, the government is concerned there'll be a backlash in renewal areas, and so I think we need to watch that one carefully. But I should add, street votes can be a way to deliver that certainty. If you create a street code for what can be built, that effectively becomes the new zoning. So it's a way to bring in zoning. So there are ways forward on that as well.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for this evening. So thank you all very much to my wonderful panelists and to you for watching along at home. And hopefully we'll see you next week for our next ASI webinars. But thank you so much for coming and good night for now. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone.